Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to get into something that is super important, but it might not seem like the most exciting topic at first glance. It might seem more back office than frontline science, but it's really, really important. And that is how to keep good records, especially lab notebooks and analytical data and how all of that fits into the big picture of GMP.
Yeah, you got it. If you care about the quality and the safety of the things that you're using,
Yeah.
especially if you're someone who works in a field like pharmaceuticals or dietary supplements or any other field that's really heavily regulated, the GMP is a huge deal. And keeping really good records according to those GMP regulations is like it's the foundation of trust. It's how we build trust in the products and in each other.
That's a great point. I mean, when you pick up that bottle of pills from the pharmacy or a vitamin or a supplement from the store, there's this trust there, right? You're trusting that what's in that bottle is exactly what it says it is and that it's safe. And all of these processes that we're going to talk about today are what make that trust possible. It's how we
Yeah.
go from, a bunch of ingredients to a final product that you can rely on.
Absolutely.
So today we're going to unpack some of the best practices for doing that from, how do you record information correctly in the first place, all the way to how is that information stored securely so that it's accurate, it's available when you need it. And we really want to get across like why each of these steps is so important for data integrity, which is a fancy way of saying, making sure that the data is good, basically,
Right.
reliable and trustworthy.
It's, making sure that the information that you're basing decisions on is the real deal, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Exactly. So to do this deep dive, we've pulled together a bunch of different sources, and I think this will give us a really well-rounded view of this whole topic. We've got some excerpts from the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR, which is, the legal framework for a lot of this stuff. We've got some industry guidelines from groups like the International Council for Harmonization, the ICH, which gives us some, best practice recommendations from experts in the field. And we've also got some great insights from GMP experts that we found in YouTube transcripts and books on GMP and quality auditing. So I think with all of these different perspectives, we can really get a good understanding of how to do this right.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, so let's start with one of the most fundamental principles in all of this, and that's contemporaneous recording. Now, that might sound a little bit, jargony and technical, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple, and it's really crucial for data integrity.
I think what's so interesting about contemporaneous recording is that it's both super simple and super important at the same time. Basically, it just means that you document things as they happen right. No waiting, no relying on your memory later. If something happens at 10:45 in the morning, you write it down at 10:45 in the morning.
Right. You don't go back at the end of the day and try to remember everything that happened.
Exactly. And this isn't just about checking boxes for the regulators. It's really about making sure that the data is as accurate as possible. Our memories, they're not perfect.
Mm.
We forget things, we mix things up, details get fuzzy over time. But when you document things in real time, you create this really accurate time-stamped record of exactly what happened. It's like taking a snapshot of the moment.
And that real-time documentation really reduces the chance of errors creeping in. Right.
Well, absolutely. And the regulations are very clear about this.
Yeah, I remember in one of the YouTube transcripts we were looking at, there was a specific mention of 21 CFR Part 111, which I think is the part that covers GMP for dietary supplements. And they were really emphasizing documenting lab activities permanently at the time they happen, whether that's, writing it down in a notebook or entering it into an electronic
You
system.
got it. It has to be done right then and there.
So yeah, so it's not just a good idea, it's actually a regulatory requirement.
It is. And the reason for that comes down to minimizing errors and maximizing accuracy. Like
Yeah.
we were saying, human memory isn't perfect.
Right.
Details can get lost or unintentionally changed over time. But by documenting things as they happen in real time, you create this really solid record of exactly what occurred. It's like a scientific time capsule. You're capturing the truth of that moment.
I like a scientific time capsule. So we've talked about why contemporaneous recording is so important for data integrity, but how does it actually work in practice? Like, how does this idea of capturing data in the moment actually play out in a lab setting?
Well, if you think about it, contemporaneous recording is like the foundation upon which the whole system of data integrity is built. If you know that the initial record was made accurately, and at the moment that something happened, everything that comes after that, all the analysis, the interpretation, the decisions that are made based on that data, it all stands on a much firmer foundation. you can trust the data because you know that the very first step was done right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it really drives home the importance of that phrase that we've seen pop up again and again in our research. If it wasn't documented, it wasn't done.
Exactly. It's not just a saying, it's a core principle. In the world of GMP, if you didn't write it down, it basically didn't happen.
Hmm.
And that might seem kind of extreme, but it's really important because it forces people to be diligent about documentation.
Right.
And it makes sure that there's this clear, auditable trail of everything that was done.
Yeah, and I think it also helped to prevent mistakes and oversights, right? Because if you know that you have to document everything, you're more likely to be careful and thorough in the first place. Exactly. It's all about accountability and transparency. And that's really what builds trust in the data.
Okay, so we've established the importance of recording things right now in real time. So let's talk about the where. And that brings us to, that classic image of scientific work, the lab notebook. It's probably what most people picture when they think about scientists working in a lab.
It's funny how that image has really stuck with us. The lab notebook really is like this central hub of information in a GMP lab. It's the primary detailed, permanent record of everything that happens, all the experiments, the observations, the data that's generated. It's not just a place to jot down numbers, it's a complete story of the scientific work that was performed.
Yeah, it's a historical record. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I remember reading in one of the YouTube transcripts about the importance of finding the right balance between detail and clarity. It's not just about writing everything down, it's about writing it down in a way that's easy to understand and doesn't leave any room for misinterpretation. Yeah, that's a really good point. You have to be thorough, but you also have to be concise. And the goal is to provide enough information so that somebody else, even years later, could pick up that notebook and understand exactly what was done, how it was done, and what the results were, all without having to rely on the memory of the person who originally did the work.
Right, because the person who did the work might not be around anymore, or they might not remember all the details. So the notebook has to be able to stand on its own. So if we were to open up a lab notebook that's being maintained to GMP standards, what are some of the key elements that we should expect to find in a typical entry? What makes a good notebook entry?
Well, I think there are a few things that are absolutely essential. First, you need to be able to tell exactly what experiment or test or activity is being documented in that entry. So that might mean giving it a clear descriptive title or referencing a specific protocol number or standard operating procedure or SOP, anything that uniquely identifies what's being done.
Okay, so clear identification is key. What else?
The date and time of the entry are super important too. That goes back to the whole idea of contemporaneous recording, right? Making sure that everything is documented as it happens.
Right, of course. What about the materials that were used in the experiment?
Yeah, so you'd want to see a detailed list of all the materials and equipment that were used. And that should include things like specific identification numbers for the equipment so that you can trace it back to its maintenance records and calibration history. Actually, 21 CFR 211.182 even specifically mentions the need to record the equipment used.
Oh, wow. So they're really specific about that.
Oh, yeah. And in one of those EAS consulting group videos, they were talking about equipment qualification, too, making sure that any equipment that's used is actually suitable for its intended purpose and that it's working properly. And that's where you get into those different qualification phases, the DQ, the IQ, the OQ, the PQ, design qualification, installation, operational qualification, performance qualification. Making sure that the equipment is designed right, that it's installed correctly, that it operates the way it should, and that it actually performs the tasks it's supposed to.
That makes sense. You want to make sure that your tools are up to the job. So you've got your equipment, you've got your materials. What about the actual procedure that was followed?
Right. So the entry should also clearly describe the steps that were taken.
Uh,
And a lot of times that will involve referencing a specific approved SOP or standard operating procedure. And then all of the observations and the raw data need to be recorded directly into the notebook as they're generated. You don't want people transcribing from scraps of paper later on because that introduces the possibility of errors.
yeah, you want that original data right there in the notebook.
Exactly. And if any calculations are done, those should be documented too. Not just the final result, but the actual steps that were taken to get there, the formulas that were used, any intermediate calculations. And of course, the final results of the experiment or test have to be stated very clearly. And sometimes you'll also see them compared against predefined acceptance criteria to make sure that they fall within the acceptable range.
Right, because you want to make sure that the results are actually meaningful, that
E-
they're not just numbers on a page, but they actually tell you something about the quality of the product or whatever it is that you're testing.
Exactly.
Now, I know that in the real world, experiments don't always go exactly according to plan. So what happens when there's a deviation from the procedure?
Yeah, that's a really important point. A good lab notebook will also include documentation of any deviations from the standard procedure, any unexpected observations, or any problems that came up during the work. So that might be something like an equipment malfunction, a variation in the materials that were used, or even just a change that had to be made to the planned procedure. And when these things happen, it's super important to record why the deviation occurred and what steps were taken to deal with it.
Yeah, it's not just about documenting the hiccups, it's about explaining them and showing how they were addressed. That makes sense.
Exactly. You want to have that complete picture. And then finally, every single entry in the lab notebook needs to be signed and dated by the person who did the work. That way you know exactly who's accountable for what.
And I think we even saw in one of the YouTube videos that sometimes companies will keep a register of specimen signatures to make sure that the signatures in the notebooks are authentic.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's all about maintaining that chain of custody and making sure that you can trace everything back to the source.
So it's really a comprehensive system. I mean, the lab notebook is like a diary of the experiment from start to finish. It's got everything in it. Now, speaking of things not always going perfectly about, I know that humans are involved in all of this, and humans make mistakes. So how do you handle corrections in a GMP environment? Because you can't just erase something or hit delete in a paper notebook.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really important because the way that errors are handled can make or break data integrity.
Yeah.
You absolutely cannot just scribble something out, use correction fluid, or try to cover up a mistake. All of those things can raise red flags because they make it look like you're trying to hide something.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you see something that's been completely obliterated, you immediately start to wonder what was under there.
Exactly. So the accepted way to make a correction in a GMP lab notebook is very specific. You draw a single line through the incorrect entry, but you do it in a way that leaves the original entry legible. You can still read what was originally written. Then you write the correct information next to the crossed out part, and the person who made the correction has to initial and date the correction.
So it's all about transparency. You're not trying to hide the mistake. You're just correcting it in a way that's clear and auditable.
Exactly. And the same goes for electronic records, too. You can't just delete data or modify it without leaving a trace. There have to be audit trails that track every change that's made to the data.
Now, I remember one of the YouTube videos had a really strong warning about falsifying records or signing for another person. Can you talk a little bit more about why that's such a big deal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Falsifying records or signing for someone else is a huge no-no in GMP. These records are legal documents, and if you intentionally misrepresent information, it undermines the whole system. It's like lying under oath, basically.
And I imagine that the consequences for that kind of thing can be pretty severe.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You could face fines, product recalls, even criminal charges. And on a more fundamental level, it just destroys trust. If people can't trust the data, then the whole system falls apart. So it's really, really important to be honest and accurate in all of your documentation.
So we've been talking a lot about paper records, but I know that a lot of data in a modern lab is generated directly by instruments and stored electronically. How does all of this fit into the world of electronic data capture?
Yeah, that's a great question. With electronic data, there are a whole bunch of other things to consider. For one thing, the software that you're using to capture, process, and store that data has to be validated, meaning you have to prove that it's working correctly and that it's producing reliable data.
And I think this is where 21 CFR Part 11 comes in, right? The regulations on electronic records and electronic signatures.
Yep, that's the one. Part 11 lays out all sorts of requirements for electronic records to make sure that they're trustworthy. And one of the big things is audit trails. Those are like electronic footprints that track every action that's taken within the system. So if somebody changes a data point or deletes a file or even just tries to access the system, there's a record of it. It's almost impossible to mess with the data without leaving a trace.
So it's kind of like having a security camera for your data.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just the software either. The instruments themselves still need to be properly maintained and calibrated. You need to have procedures in place for that, and you need to keep records of all the maintenance activities and calibrations. And a lot of times that's done electronically now too.
Right. So it's really a whole system. It's not just about the paper notebooks anymore. It's about managing all of the data, whether it's on paper or in a computer system.
Yeah, that's right.
So we've talked about how data is captured. Let's talk about what happens after it's been recorded. Is it just filed away somewhere?
No, not at all. Once the data has been captured, whether it's in a notebook or electronically, it has to be reviewed. And this is a really important step because it helps to catch errors and make sure that everything is complete and accurate.
And I think we saw in several of the YouTube videos that there are often multiple levels of review, right?
Yeah, exactly. The person who did the work will usually review their own data first,
Hmm.
and then it might be reviewed by a peer or a colleague, and then a supervisor will look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes even the quality assurance department will do a final review. It's like having multiple sets of eyes on the data to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks.
And I imagine that preventing transcription errors is really important too, especially when you're moving data from one system to another or from instruments to reports.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Transcription errors can be a big problem. So you want to minimize manual data entry as much as possible. And when you do have to transcribe data, you need to have procedures in place to verify that it's been done correctly. Like having a second person check the data against the original source.
So it's all about checks and balances, making sure that the data is accurate and reliable every step of the way.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about what happens to the data long term. How do you make sure that it's stored securely and that it's accessible when you need it?
Yeah, secure storage is a really big deal. You have to protect these records from loss, damage, unauthorized access, and alteration. And that goes for both paper records and electronic data.
And I know that there are regulations that specify how long certain records have to be kept right.
Yeah, that's right. The FDA and other regulatory bodies have very specific requirements for record retention. So, for example, one of the YouTube transcripts mentioned that data related to serious adverse events for dietary supplements might have to be kept for up to 6 years.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And there are general GMP regulations, too, that lay out retention periods for different types of records. So companies need to have systems in place to make sure that they're meeting those requirements.
So it's not just about stuffing things in a filing cabinet or backing up a hard drive. There's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, you have to have a plan for how you're going to archive the data and how you're going to make sure that it stays accessible and readable for however long you're required to keep it. And with paper records, that might mean storing them in climate-controlled environments and in secure facilities. And with electronic records, it means having good backup systems and data migration plans so that you can still access the data even as technology changes.
Yeah, because technology changes so quickly these days. You don't want to end up with a bunch of data that you can't even read anymore because the software is obsolete. So there's a lot to think about. We've covered a lot of ground here, from capturing data in real time to storing it securely for years to come. So what are some of the biggest challenges that companies face in trying to meet all of these requirements?
Honestly, one of the biggest challenges is just human error. People make mistakes. They forget things. They transpose numbers. They might not understand the procedures correctly. And all of those things can lead to errors in the data. And then there are challenges related to data management, making sure that all the data is organized and labeled properly so that you can find what you need when you need it. And that can be tricky, especially when you're dealing with large volumes of data.
And what about electronic systems? I imagine there are challenges there too.
Yeah, for sure. Electronic systems can be great for data management, but they also come with their own set of challenges, like making sure that the systems are validated and secure and that they comply with all the regulations. And then there's the issue of data integrity, making sure that the data in the system hasn't been altered or corrupted in any way. So there's a lot to think about.
So given all of those challenges, what are some strategies that companies can use to try to overcome them?
Well, I think one of the most important things is training, you know, making sure that everybody who's involved in data collection and handling understands the importance of GMP and the procedures that they need to follow. And that training needs to be ongoing. It can't just be a one-time thing.
Right. You have to keep people up to date.
Exactly. And then it's also important to have clear SOPs, standard operating procedures for all of the key processes, step-by-step instructions that people can follow. And those SOPs need to be reviewed and updated regularly to make sure that they're still accurate and relevant.
So it's about having systems in place to prevent errors from happening in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. And then you also need to have systems in place to catch errors if they do happen. So that means doing regular reviews and audits of the data and the documentation.
Yeah.
And it also means having a culture of quality where people feel comfortable speaking up if they see something that's not right.
So it's not just about the rules and the procedures, it's also about the culture of the company. making sure that everybody understands the importance of data integrity and that they're all working together to achieve it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It has to be a team effort.
Well, I think this has been a really insightful deep dive into a topic that's often overlooked, but that's absolutely essential for making sure that the products we use are safe and effective.
I agree. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of scientific discovery and innovation. But it's really important to remember that all of that has to be grounded in solid data. And that means having robust systems in place for capturing, managing, and protecting that data.
So for our listeners out there, we hope that this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the importance of data integrity and the many steps that go into ensuring it. Because ultimately, it's all about trust. When you pick up a bottle of medicine or a jar of vitamins, you're putting your trust in the company that made it and in the systems that they have in place to guarantee its quality and safety.
So as you go about your day, we encourage you to think about the data that's all around you, the data that's used to make decisions that affect your life, and to appreciate the role that GMP plays in making sure that that data is reliable and trustworthy.
And that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.